Hey folks, Mr. Howard here, coming to you from my guest room with a ye old quarantine lesson on world building in creative writing. This is, a fair amount of review stuff I've talked about already this year, but also some fun material about world building to help you. I mean, you've all written fantasies, you've all written sci-fi. Some of you've turned in some good cyberpunk. There's been lots of writing in the genres that we're talking about here in class, and we've talked about how to pace and how to structure and a lot of the elements that I'm going to be going over here. But just to help you organize your thoughts and help you do some world building activities, since last time I had a meeting, people decided that the thing they wanted to focus on and work on for the next few weeks at least is world building and that sort of creativity in their optional assignments. So this is sort of the lecture to start all that off and get you thinking about those things. So the first thing I want to say about world building in creative writing is before you build a world, you've got to select a genre. You want to know what kind of a story you're writing so that you can craft the world to fit that story in a number of ways. So if you're writing fantasy, there's all kinds of fantasy genres. We talk about fantasy, but like there's high fantasy, which is your Lord of the Rings sort of fantasy with elves and dwarves and like all of those elements that you would expect to have in Middle Earth. Then there's Arthurian fantasy, so fantasy that's set in England in like King Arthur's day, and so you're mixing elements of history and fantasy, so it's the real world, but like you end up with monsters and dragons and goblins and cool things like that. So you could call it Arthurian, or you could call it sort of historical fantasy. Another example of that would be Beowulf. If you've ever read Beowulf, it's set in Denmark, but it actually involves monsters and dragons and things that couldn't exist in the real world. So that would be sort of a medieval historical fantasy. You got urban fantasy, sort of your Shadowrun kind of a thing where people are living in cities, but there's lots of fantastic elements. Space fantasy, that's Star Wars. It's not sci-fi. There's guys with swords and using magic and all of that kind of stuff. So it's really a fantasy that's set in space. There's horror fantasy, that involves creepy monsters and undead, and like the tone is very scary. There's portal fantasy, where you seem to have a fantasy world that parallels our world, and you get there through some sort of portal, whether it's platform 9 3/4, or it's going into Camp Half-Blood, or it's a wardrobe in some room of your house. Like there's lots of ways to portal people into a fantastic land. There's grimdark fantasy, which is like Game of Thrones. Things don't turn out well. It's not a fantasy world where happily ever after really occurs. Things just turn from bad to worse all the time for the characters, and bad things happen on a regular basis. You got paranormal fantasy, which is fantasies involving ghosts and things. It's sort of like the Graveyard Book, if you've read any Neil Gaiman. And then there's, like various other genres, young adult, romance. There's lots of ways to connect fantasy. And so you want to think about your genre and what your genre characteristics are and how you're going to meet those genre characteristics with the world that you create, how your characters are going to get in the world. Are they born there? Where do they fit? Those sorts of things. If you're doing sci-fi, again, there's a bunch of genres in sci-fi, and you want to think about those genres as well. There's what's called hard science fiction, in which case everything's going to be scientific and it's all going to fit and be realistic. Really hard to write hard sci-fi. You kind of have to be an astrophysicist to do it. And then only astrophysicists understand it. So there's not a lot of hard sci-fi out there just because of the difficulty of the genre. There's soft sci-fi, though. That's like Star Trek. You try and be scientific when you can and make things make sense, but you fudge things, and science is sort of magic in some ways. So that'd be soft sci-fi. You got cyberpunk, stuff that's sci-fi, but it's set, on Earth or on some other planet, but it's in a future that's, slightly advanced from ours with advanced technology, but you still got, like cities and all that kind of stuff. Space fantasy is sort of, like I said, Star Wars. It falls in the fantasy bubble. It falls in the sci-fi bubble. We don't really know where to place it. Horror, like you can do a sci-fi horror, like there's been a few movies like that. Aliens comes to mind, and Alien. Both of those have horror elements. If you watched Event Horizon, so you can. I mean, space is scary. There's a vacuum out there that's waiting to take you and suck you in and turn you into a human popsicle that explodes. Yeah, it's bad news. So you could use that horror genre with your space real easily. Then there's steampunk, which is this weird historical sci-fi element where it's sort of like Victorian times and everything's steam technology, but you have all these modern technologies involving steam, and it's cool. Like there was the Mortal Engines series and stuff like that. So there's lots of sci-fi genres, probably more than I put out. There's definitely military sci-fi. He's sort of like the Warhammer games sort of books and all that kind of stuff. So you just want to think through and pick a genre. And once you know your genre, then you can start creating your world. The other thing I would say you need to have before you start world building is you've got your genre. Then you want to actually take the time to focus in on your tone. What is the tone of your story? Is it dark? Is it comic? Is it light? Is it romantic? There's a myriad tones out there. But whatever your world is, it's not only going to fit your genre, but it's going to fit your tone. Theoretically, for example, I'm just going to use Tolkien as an example because I wrote a master's thesis on J.R.R. Tolkien in grad school. But The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings theoretically take place in the same world, but they have drastically different tones. The Lord of the Rings has this high fantasy world, and so does The Hobbit, but The Hobbit's got sort of a comic tone. It's got a comic undertone throughout the whole thing. You're looking at this bumbling, fat, middle-aged hobbit going on a quest that he doesn't want to go on, sort of. There's elements of that with Frodo in The Lord of the Rings, but it's very different. It's much more serious. It's much more high and noble, and there's all those things going on in The Lord of the Rings that really aren't in The Hobbit until the last few chapters. I would say that The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit's tone are the same, like in the Battle of the Five Armies section. But other than that, they're very, very different. So know your tone. You want to figure out what your genre is and what your tone is. Once you've got those, then you can start looking into how you want to build your world. And so the first thing I'm going to tell you with world building is scale and scope is really important. I tend to think of it, how do I want to explain this? So, I wrote a novel, right? 3 Days and 2 Nights. And I'm using Arthurian adventure. It's an Arthurian fantasy. I tried to mimic that Hobbit tone that starts out more comic and becomes, as the story goes on, becomes more and more serious. And so I've got a clear world. I've got a clear tone. It's an amusing adventure. So I've got those things. It takes place in England. So I sort of know the location. So there's a lot of things that I discovered writing this when I went to work it out. But I studied fiction, and I studied how authors put things together, and I figured out that there was a flaw in a lot of stories that I read, which has to do with scope. A lot of people, when they world build, they've got the microscope on like the broadest power. They're like seeing everything. They know the whole world, and they've got this world map, and they know what all the countries are, and they know what all the rulers of the countries are, and they know what the relationships between the countries are, and they have some sort of, dark lord or something, and they've got it all worked out, this huge world-shaping giant plan. You can't write about that. It's really difficult to write it. You need to be invested in individual characters. Those characters need to have individual relationships. Those characters are moving in very, very restricted understandings of the world where all they can see is what their own point of view sees. So you can't see the big picture as a character, especially not if you have a limited narrator of any kind. And so a lot of authors make this mistake in their world building where they spend a huge amount of time making this big picture world when literally everything happens at the local level. So what I want you to do in your mind is I want you to picture, and I think I said this in first quarter at some point, I want you to picture a microscope. You know how like when you're looking through a microscope, it's got 3 levels of magnification and you can switch between those levels? that's how writing a story is. That's how world building is. You've got to world build not just on that global level, but there's three levels. There's a global level. There's sort of this, I'm going to call it the state level, and there's a local level. And you can think about it in terms of where we live here. You live in a town. That's the local level. That's your everyday experience. You go through your everyday experience, and you see people, and you talk to people, and you're invested in them. And then you can move up to, either you can call it the county level, you can call it the state level. We got Virginia. So you've got the town you live in, and then you've got the Virginia. And then you've got sort of like the United States. So you've got these three different levels. Now, obviously, there's more than three levels here, because then you've got the globe, and you've got, like all of that stuff. But how much of your day do you actually spend interacting on a global level? Hopefully, none would be my answer. You spend your whole day on the local level. And so if you plan this huge global level thing, then maybe it's interesting from sort of like a fake historical perspective, but as a reader, you're invested in characters, and characters live on the local level. So you've got to develop your world on three levels. You've got to know as a writer what's going on that global level. Sure, you've got to know that, but you also have to know what's going on sort of on the intermediary level, and then everything happens on the local level. So most of your time should really be spent on that level of world building in which your characters live. And when you think about, like, I guess Google Maps is a cool way to do it. When you think about Google Maps and you think about navigating between those levels, zoom in and zoom out. You zoom out, you can get the whole world there in a map. But when you zoom in, there's always more to see. There's always more to see until you get down to the local. And then, that's where we all live. So I feel like I beat that into the ground. I'm gonna stop there. So what I want to assign you in this first assignment on world building, and there's going to be a series of them, is going to have to do with working those three levels. So, fantasy starts with a map. That's actually going to be your first assignment, is to make a map. But I'm not going to ask you to make a map. I'm going to ask you to make 3 maps. So whatever your fantasy story is, whatever your genre is, or whatever your characters are, you'll start with a global map. Figure out what the world looks like, who the key players are, what all that international political stuff is, and then you'll move down. You'll say, all right, what's the intermediate level? What area of this world do my characters exist in? And so you'll make a smaller map of the country or the area in which your characters live, and then I'm going to ask you to make the local map. What's the town they live in look like? Where do they live in relation to other people? Those sorts of things. So we're going to look at maps for this first assignment, and you can make those 3 maps. You can take pictures of them, you can upload them, and I can look at them on the page. That's fine. But let's talk about some of the things that you're going to think about when you're making these maps. First thing, obvious, geography. World building involves every aspect of education, really. So when you're making your maps, follow your earth science. Like you remember learning earth science, watersheds, mountain ranges, how it all works. In order for your world to be believable, the physics has to be believable. Your rivers have to flow, downstream. You can't have a river that sort of flows in 2 directions downstream. That doesn't happen. They're always converging like a tree branch into a single stream that goes into the ocean. Your mountains have to, you think about plate tectonics and how that works. So you have to craft a believable world. If it's unbelievable, you're going to lose readers. So think about those sorts of things, when you make your 3 levels of the map. We also want to think about races, like depending on your genre, you may have aliens or, like hobbits and dwarves and elves or other creatures. Think about races and how they interplay. How do they interplay in a global sense? How do they interplay in a state sense? How do they interplay in a local sense? What kind of locals are living with your characters? Same things with factions and governments and politics. you want to think politically. Why do particular factions not like other factions? Does it have to do with economics? We can think about economics. What's the economics on a global level? Like the United States economics in the world. What's the economics on a state level? What's Virginia's economic situation? And then your town. So Virginia has an economic situation